On my 65th birthday, my daughter-in-law handed me a gift box with a cold smirk and said, "This will change your life forever." Inside was only my husband's old wedding ring. When I looked up in shock, she whispered, "Ask your son about the will." Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. I'm Margaret, and for 65 years, I believed that family meant everything. I spent 4 decades as a third-grade teacher, nurturing other people's children while raising my own son, David, with endless patience and unconditional love. Every morning for 37 years of marriage, I woke up next to Robert, my gentle giant of a husband who worked double shifts at the steel mill so I could afford to stay home summers with David. We weren't rich in money, but we were millionaires in love and dreams. Our little house on Maple Street became the heart of our neighborhood. I was the woman who baked cookies for every school fundraiser, who opened my doors to any child who needed a safe place, who turned our backyard into a wonderland for birthday parties and graduations. When the neighbors went through divorces or job losses, my kitchen table became their sanctuary. I never asked for anything in return because that's what good people do. They give freely, they love deeply, and they trust that kindness will be returned. Robert and I poured our hearts into that house. We painted every room together, planted every flower in the garden, and built memories in every corner. When David brought Sarah home 6 years ago, I welcomed her like the daughter I never had. I taught her my secret recipes, included her in our holiday traditions, and loved her children as my own grandchildren. I thought I was gaining a daughter, not losing everything I held dear. 6 months ago, my world shattered when Robert collapsed in his workshop. One moment he was fixing our grandson's bicycle, humming that old Frank Sinatra song he loved, and the next moment he was gone. The heart attack was massive and sudden, leaving me drowning in grief and struggling to understand a world without my partner. But even through my pain, I kept being the mother and grandmother my family needed. I organized the funeral, comforted everyone else, and quietly carried the weight of losing my soulmate while making sure everyone else felt supported. I spent decades putting others first, sacrificing my own dreams and desires to build a foundation of love for my family. When David needed college money, Robert and I took out a second mortgage. When he struggled to find work after graduation, we helped with his rent and groceries for 2 years. When Sarah wanted that expensive wedding, I sold my grandmother's jewelry to help pay for it. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in love, in family, in building something beautiful that would last beyond our lifetime. I was the type of woman who remembered everyone's birthdays, who kept photo albums updated and holiday traditions alive, who made sure no family gathering happened without homemade food and genuine warmth. My friends called me the family glue, the one who kept everyone connected and cared for. I believed that devotion and selflessness would create an unbreakable bond with the people I loved most. But standing in my living room on my birthday, holding Robert's wedding ring in my trembling hands, while Sarah's cruel words echoed in my ears, I realized that sometimes the people you love most are capable of unimaginable betrayal. The woman who had given everything to her family was about to discover that love and sacrifice mean nothing when greed takes over human hearts. My days had settled into a rhythm of gentle mourning and quiet purpose. Each morning, I would brew Robert's favorite dark roast coffee in the same blue ceramic pot we'd received as a wedding gift 37 years ago. The ritual brought me comfort, even though I was the only one drinking it now. I'd sit at our kitchen table, the one Robert built by hand from oak wood, and watch the sunrise paint our garden in soft, golden light. The garden had become my sanctuary. Robert and I planted every rose bush, every tomato plant, and every patch of herbs together over the years. Now, tending to his beloved vegetables felt like having a conversation with his spirit. I'd water the cherry tomatoes he'd been so proud of, deadhead the marigolds he claimed kept the pests away, and carefully prune the grapevines that produced the sweetest fruit every August. My neighbors often stopped by to compliment the garden, and I'd beam with pride, telling them how Robert had designed every corner with such love and attention. Twice a week, I'd drive to Hillcrest Cemetery with fresh flowers from our garden. Robert's headstone was simple granite, engraved with beloved husband and father and a line from our wedding song. I'd sit on the small bench I'd purchased and placed beside his grave, telling him about my week, sharing neighborhood gossip, and asking for his guidance on decisions both big and small. Sometimes I'd bring his favorite crossword puzzles and work on them there, reading the clues aloud as if he were helping me solve them. Our house remained exactly as Robert left it. His coffee mug still sat in the same spot on the kitchen counter. His reading glasses lay folded on the nightstand next to his favorite mystery novel, bookmark still marking page 247. His workshop in the basement stayed untouched, tools hanging precisely where he'd organized them, current projects waiting patiently for hands that would never return. Friends suggested I might want to pack away his belongings, but I wasn't ready to erase the traces of our life together. Sunday dinners had become my greatest joy and my weekly masterpiece. Every week, David's family would come over, along with whatever neighbors or friends needed a home-cooked meal. I'd spend Saturday shopping for ingredients and Sunday morning cooking elaborate spreads. Pot roast with all the fixings, homemade rolls that Robert always claimed were better than his mother's, and desserts that made everyone groan with satisfaction. The dining room would fill with laughter, conversation, and the kind of warmth that made a house feel truly alive. I found purpose in the small acts of love that had defined my life. I'd surprise David's family with unexpected visits, always bringing homemade cookies or a casserole I'd accidentally made too much of. I'd babysit my grandchildren whenever Sarah needed time for herself, reading them stories and teaching them the same games I'd played with David when he was small. When neighbors faced illness or hardship, my kitchen became a production center for comfort food and caring gestures. Evenings were for quiet reflection. I'd sit in Robert's favorite armchair, the worn leather recliner where he'd watched his baseball games, and work on crossword puzzles or read books from our local library. Sometimes I'd call my sister in Florida or old teaching colleagues, maintaining the friendships that had sustained me through decades of life's ups and downs. This peaceful routine felt sustainable, even healing. I believed I was creating a new chapter of my life while honoring the beautiful chapters Robert and I had written together. I thought my family appreciated my strength and resilience. I had no idea that my quiet contentment was being viewed as an obstacle to overcome, and that the people I loved most were already planning to dismantle everything Robert and I had built together. It started with small moments that felt slightly off, like a song played in the wrong key. During our usual Sunday dinner 3 weeks after my birthday, I was serving my famous apple pie when Sarah casually mentioned how expensive home maintenance had become. "Property taxes just keep going up," she said, cutting into her slice with deliberate precision. "And these old houses need so much work: the roof, the plumbing, the electrical systems." Her tone was conversational, but something about the way she emphasized old houses made me pause mid-bite. David nodded in agreement, which surprised me because he'd never shown much interest in home repairs before. "Mom, when's the last time you had the furnace inspected or the foundation checked?" He was asking practical questions, the kind any caring son might ask, but his voice carried an edge I didn't recognize. When I mentioned that Robert had always handled those things and I wasn't sure about schedules, I caught Sarah and David exchanging a quick glance across the table. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it felt loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. The following week, Sarah began asking questions about my daily routine with unusual interest. "Do you ever feel lonely in this big house all by yourself?" she asked while we were washing dishes together. "I mean, it's so much space for one person. Don't you think a smaller place might be more manageable?" When I told her I loved my home and found comfort in maintaining the life Robert and I built, she pressed further. "But what about practical things? What if you fell and no one was around? What if there was an emergency?" Her concern felt genuine on the surface, but something about her persistence made me uncomfortable. She kept returning to themes of safety, practicality, and the challenges of aging alone. When I mentioned that I felt perfectly capable of managing my home and had wonderful neighbors who checked on me regularly, she'd nod politely but then circle back to the same worries. It was as if she was trying to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to live independently. David's behavior shifted too, in ways that were harder to pinpoint. He began commenting on my memory when I'd misplace small items or forget minor details. "Are you sure you remember that correctly, Mom?" became a frequent phrase. When I mentioned plans to donate some of Robert's tools to the local vocational school, David quickly interjected, "Let's not make any hasty decisions about Dad's things. Maybe we should wait a while longer." The sharpness in his voice surprised me, and I noticed Sarah nodding emphatically in agreement. During one visit, I overheard Sarah on the phone in the living room while I was preparing lunch. She was speaking quietly, but I caught fragments. Expensive to maintain, and not getting any younger, and needs to start thinking practically. When she noticed me listening, she quickly ended the call and smiled brightly, claiming it was just a friend asking about childcare recommendations. The strangest incident happened when I found real estate flyers tucked under my car windshield wipers after church. They featured retirement communities and assisted living facilities, all with cheerful photos of elderly people enjoying social activities and worry-free living. When I mentioned it to David, asking if he knew how I might have gotten on such mailing lists, he shrugged dismissively. "Those places send advertisements everywhere," he said. "Probably just random marketing." But Sarah's eyes lit up with what looked like opportunity, and she immediately began discussing the benefits of senior living communities. I tried to dismiss these moments as coincidences or misinterpretations on my part. Surely my grief was making me overly sensitive, reading meanings that weren't there. But deep in my heart, a small voice was whispering that something fundamental had changed in my relationship with David and Sarah, and I was only beginning to glimpse the true nature of that change. I spent the following days convincing myself that my suspicions were nothing more than grief playing tricks on my mind. Sitting in Robert's favorite armchair with a cup of tea, I reasoned through every concerning moment, finding innocent explanations for each one. Sarah's questions about the house weren't manipulative. They were practical concerns from a daughter-in-law who cared about my well-being. David's comments about my memory weren't dismissive. They were natural worry from a son who'd just lost his father and feared losing his mother, too. "You're being paranoid, Margaret," I whispered to myself, the words echoing in the quiet living room. Robert had always teased me about having an overactive imagination, especially during the mystery novels we'd read together. "You're looking for plots where there aren't any," he'd say with that gentle smile. I could almost hear his voice now, encouraging me to give our family the benefit of the doubt. These were people who loved me, who had mourned Robert's loss alongside me, who surely had my best interests at heart. I decided to interpret their behavior through the lens of love rather than suspicion. When Sarah brought up home maintenance costs, she was probably genuinely worried about my financial security as a widow. When David questioned my memory, perhaps he was concerned about the stress of grief affecting my cognitive abilities. These were normal family concerns, weren't they? I'd read articles about adult children worrying about aging parents, about the difficult conversations families needed to have about future care and living arrangements. During my weekly visit to Robert's grave, I found myself seeking his guidance more desperately than usual. "Am I losing my mind?" I asked his headstone, arranging fresh daisies in the small vase. "Are they really trying to help me? Or am I right to feel uneasy?" The cemetery was peaceful, with only the sound of wind through the oak trees, but I felt no clear answer. Robert had always been my voice of reason, my anchor in stormy emotional waters. Without him, I felt untethered and uncertain about my own judgment. I threw myself into my normal routines with renewed determination, as if perfect domesticity could restore the harmony I thought I was imagining cracks in. I spent extra hours in the garden, making sure every flower bed was immaculate. I prepared even more elaborate Sunday dinners, setting the table with our finest china and cooking David's childhood favorites. I volunteered extra hours at the local food bank and took on additional shifts reading to children at the library, keeping my mind occupied with service to others. When Sarah called to ask about my long-term plans, I answered with cheerful vagueness, refusing to acknowledge any underlying concerns. "Oh, I'm just taking things one day at a time," I'd say brightly. Robert always said worry was like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do but doesn't get you anywhere. I deflected her questions about home modifications for aging in place, about power of attorney arrangements, about what I'd want if I became unable to care for myself. I even convinced myself that the retirement community flyers were indeed random marketing, despite finding 3 more sets over the following weeks. When David suggested we meet with a financial planner just to make sure everything's in order, I agreed readily, interpreting it as responsible family planning rather than anything more sinister. I was determined to be the understanding mother and grateful mother-in-law, the woman who trusted her family completely and never questioned their motives. But late at night, when the house was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, that small voice of unease wouldn't be entirely silenced. It whispered doubts in the darkness, suggesting that love and manipulation could sometimes wear the same mask, and that the people closest to us were often the ones capable of the deepest betrayals. The discovery happened on a dreary Thursday morning while I was cleaning David's childhood bedroom, something I'd been avoiding since Robert's death. The room had remained largely untouched since David moved out, filled with his old trophies, school yearbooks, and boxes of memories I'd been saving for his future children to explore. I'd finally decided it was time to organize everything properly, maybe even convert it into a reading room as Robert and I had once discussed. I was dusting the old wooden bookshelf when several books shifted, revealing a manila folder that had been wedged behind Robert's collection of military history novels. The folder was thick and new, definitely not something from David's childhood. My heart began beating faster as I pulled it free, wondering why important documents would be hidden in such an unusual place. Inside, my world tilted sideways. The first document was a professional property appraisal for our house, dated just 2 months ago. The estimated value made my breath catch: $347,000, far more than Robert and I had ever imagined our modest home was worth. But why would someone need a current appraisal? We weren't planning to sell, refinance, or take out any loans. My hands trembled as I flipped to the next page. Bank statements for Robert's business account showed transactions I'd never seen before. Large withdrawals had been made in the weeks leading up to his death. $15,000 here, $8,000 there. Money transferred to accounts I didn't recognize. Robert had always handled the business finances while I managed our household budget, but these amounts were staggering. We'd been married for 37 years, and he'd never made financial decisions of this magnitude without discussing them with me first. The most devastating discovery was buried beneath the financial papers, a will that bore Robert's signature but contained provisions I'd never heard him mention. According to this document, dated just 3 weeks before his death, Robert was leaving the house and the majority of his assets directly to David, with only a small monthly allowance designated for my care in an appropriate assisted living facility. The language was cold and clinical, nothing like the loving protection Robert had always promised me. My legs gave way, and I sank onto David's old bed, staring at the signature that looked like Robert's handwriting, but somehow felt wrong. The R in Robert was slightly different than I remembered, the loops less confident than his usual bold strokes. But grief could be affecting my memory, couldn't it? People's handwriting could change when they were ill or under stress. The date on the will haunted me most of all. 3 weeks before Robert died, he'd been heavily sedated following his first heart episode, barely conscious most days and confused when he was awake. I'd spent those weeks by his hospital bedside, holding his hand and advocating with doctors about his pain medication. When could he have met with a lawyer? When could he have made such monumental decisions about our shared life? I found photocopies of retirement home brochures paper-clipped to the back of the folder, with specific facilities circled in red ink and notes scrawled in margins. Waiting list. Accepts Medicare. Memory care available. Someone had been researching my future living arrangements with thorough, methodical precision. Sitting in that room surrounded by David's childhood memories, his Little League trophies, his high school graduation photo, the crayon drawings I'd saved from when he was 5, I felt like I was looking at evidence of a stranger's life. The son who had created these innocent childhood artifacts couldn't be the same person who had hidden these documents behind books in his mother's house. But the folder was real, the signatures were real, and the devastating truth was becoming impossible to deny. Someone had been planning my future without my knowledge or consent, and that someone had access to Robert's business accounts and the ability to influence his final decisions during his most vulnerable moments. I confronted David the very next evening, the damning folder clutched in my shaking hands as he walked through the front door for what I thought would be our usual Thursday dinner. But there would be nothing usual about this conversation. Sarah wasn't with him. She was at her book club, he explained cheerfully, completely unaware that I'd spent the last 24 hours rehearsing this moment in my mind, trying to find words for the unthinkable. "David, we need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I spread the documents across our kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays and shared thousands of meals. "I found these in your old room. I need you to explain what they mean." His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, calculation, and finally something cold I'd never seen in my son's eyes before. He sat down heavily, ran his hands through his hair, and let out a long sigh that sounded more annoyed than ashamed. "Mom, you weren't supposed to find those yet. We were going to talk to you about this when the time was right." "When the time was right?" I repeated, my voice rising. The time was right for what? For stealing my home? For putting me in a nursing home without my knowledge? For forging your dying father's signature on legal documents? David's demeanor shifted completely. The son who had hugged me at Robert's funeral, who had promised to take care of me, was replaced by a stranger with calculating eyes and a voice devoid of warmth. "Nobody forged anything, Mom. Dad signed that will himself. He was worried about you living alone in this big house, about you making poor financial decisions in your grief. He wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of properly." "Your father was barely conscious those last weeks," I protested, tears streaming down my face. "He couldn't even remember my name half the time because of the medication. When could he possibly have made these decisions?" "He had moments of clarity," David replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "The lawyer came to the hospital twice. Dad understood that this house is too much for you to handle alone, and frankly, it's worth too much money to just let you struggle with the upkeep and taxes. The nursing home we've selected is very nice. You'll have people your own age to socialize with, activities, medical care on site." "You've already selected a nursing home?" The words hit me like physical blows. "How long have you been planning this?" Sarah's voice came from the doorway. Apparently book club had ended early, or perhaps this confrontation had been orchestrated. "We've been planning this since Dad got sick," she said, her mask of concern finally slipping away completely. "Someone had to think practically about the future. You're 65 years old, Mom. You can't maintain this house forever, and we can't keep worrying about you having accidents or making mistakes." "The house will sell quickly in this market," David continued, his voice businesslike and cruel. "After we pay off the remaining mortgage and the nursing home deposits, there should be enough left for your care for several years. It's really the most sensible solution for everyone." I stared at these two people I thought I knew. People I had loved and sacrificed for, people I had welcomed into my heart and home. Everyone? I whispered. What about what I want? What about the life your father and I built together? David shrugged with devastating casualness. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Grief affects judgment. We're making these decisions because we love you and want what's best for you. The papers are already filed. The house goes on the market next month. The betrayal was complete and spoken with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity born from devastating betrayal and began searching through documents I'd never thought to question before. What I discovered over the following days revealed a conspiracy so methodical and heartless that it took my breath away. This wasn't just about stealing my house. They had orchestrated the systematic dismantling of everything Robert and I had built together. I started with Robert's business account statements, calling the bank to request complete records for the past year. The customer service representative's sympathetic voice guided me through transactions that painted a horrifying picture. Beginning 6 months before Robert's death, large withdrawals had been made using a power of attorney I'd never seen before. David had been systematically draining the account that was supposed to be my security net, transferring nearly $80,000 to various accounts over the course of Robert's illness. The power of attorney document, which I found in David's desk during his work hours, was dated during Robert's first hospitalization, when he'd been heavily sedated and confused. I remembered that day clearly. Robert hadn't recognized me, had called me by his sister's name, and had been unable to feed himself. Yet somehow, according to this document, he'd been competent enough to sign over complete financial control to his son. My investigation revealed that Sarah had been busy too. She'd already contacted 3 different nursing homes, putting down deposits and filling out admission paperwork in my name. When I called Golden Years Manor, the cheerful administrator referred to me as David's mother and confirmed that my family had arranged for a memory care unit, explaining that I was showing early signs of dementia and would need specialized supervision. They had painted me as a confused, declining elderly woman who posed a danger to herself. The cruelest discovery came when I reached out to my grandchildren. 8-year-old Emma innocently revealed that Mommy and Daddy had been telling them that Grandma was getting sick in her brain and would need to go to a special place where doctors could help her remember things. They'd been preparing my own grandchildren for my disappearance from their lives, framing it as a medical necessity rather than greed-driven abandonment. David had already contacted real estate agents, scheduling the house to be listed as soon as the probate process was complete. When I called the number on the business card I found in his jacket pocket, the agent knew all about the family situation and expressed sympathy for families dealing with elderly parents who couldn't accept reality. They'd crafted a narrative where I was the problem, the confused old woman standing in the way of sensible decisions. The financial web grew more tangled with each discovery. They'd opened a joint account using the forged power of attorney, transferring Robert's pension benefits and Social Security directly into their control. They'd canceled my health insurance, claiming I'd be covered under the nursing home's plan. They'd even contacted my longtime family doctor, suggesting that I was showing signs of cognitive decline and might benefit from a psychiatric evaluation. When I visited Robert's lawyer, our family lawyer for 20 years, I learned that David had convinced him I was becoming unstable and paranoid since Robert's death. The lawyer had been led to believe that the family was protecting me from making poor decisions in my grief. David had been positioning himself as the responsible son caring for his deteriorating mother, while I'd been completely unaware that my mental competency was being systematically questioned. The conspiracy extended even to our neighbors. Sarah had been having quiet conversations over back fences, expressing concerns about my ability to maintain the house and suggesting that I'd been acting strangely since Robert's death. She'd been laying groundwork to make my eventual disappearance seem like the inevitable result of declining mental health rather than calculated theft. They hadn't just stolen my money and planned to steal my home. They'd stolen my reputation, my relationships, and my identity, replacing them with the fictional narrative of a confused old woman who needed to be managed and controlled. That night, alone in the house that no longer felt like home, I finally allowed the full weight of betrayal to crush me. I collapsed on the living room floor, surrounded by 37 years of memories that suddenly felt like lies. Every family photo on the mantel seemed to mock me. David's graduation, his wedding day, family Christmas mornings, filled with laughter and love. Had any of it been real, or had I been raising a stranger who was simply waiting for the right moment to destroy me? I crawled through the house like a wounded animal, touching everything Robert and I had chosen together. The couch where we'd watched countless movies, arguing good-naturedly about his action films and my romantic comedies. The kitchen table where we'd planned our dreams, discussed our fears, and shared the intimate details of a life built on trust and partnership. The bedroom where we'd held each other through illness and joy, promising to protect each other until death do us part. But death hadn't parted us. Our son had. In Robert's workshop, I pressed my face against his workbench and sobbed until my chest ached. The smell of sawdust and oil still lingered, along with the ghost of his presence. I could almost see him there, carefully measuring wood for another project, humming while he worked, always building something to make our life more beautiful. He'd crafted our kitchen cabinets by hand, built the back deck where we'd watched countless sunsets, constructed the greenhouse where I'd started my seedlings every spring. "How could you leave me alone to face this?" I whispered to his memory, anger mixing with grief in ways that made me feel guilty and desperate. Robert had worked himself to exhaustion to provide for our family, taking overtime shifts even when his back ached, saving every penny so we could give David opportunities we'd never had. He'd sacrificed his health and his time because he believed family was everything. Now that devotion had been turned into a weapon against me. I remembered every sacrifice I'd made with devastating clarity. The promotion I'd turned down because David needed me home during his difficult teenage years. The vacation Robert and I had canceled so we could help pay for David's wedding. The years I'd worked part-time instead of full-time so I could be available whenever our family needed me. Every choice had been made out of love, but love was apparently meaningless to the people who had benefited most from it. The photographs were the worst torture. Baby David, chubby and innocent, reaching his tiny hands toward the camera. 5-year-old David, gap-toothed and giggling, hugging me tight after I'd bandaged his scraped knee. Teenage David, sullen but grateful when I'd defended him against Robert's discipline. College David, calling home every week to share his struggles and victories. Wedding David, tears in his eyes as he thanked me for being the best mother he could have asked for. Where had that child gone? When had love turned into calculation? When had the boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms become a man who could look his grieving mother in the eye and lie about her dead husband's wishes? I found myself in David's old bedroom clutching his high school yearbook, reading the inscription he'd written to me. "Mom, thank you for always believing in me and for teaching me right from wrong. I promise I'll make you proud and take care of you when you're old, just like you took care of me. Love always, David." The promises felt like razors cutting through my heart. I had raised him to be honest, compassionate, and protective of those who were vulnerable. Instead, I'd apparently raised a predator who saw my grief as an opportunity and my trust as weakness to be exploited. I cried until there were no tears left, only the hollow ache of a mother whose greatest achievement had become her greatest destroyer. I woke up on David's bedroom floor at dawn, my face swollen from tears and my body stiff from a night spent curled around his old yearbook. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or why every muscle ached. Then the memories crashed back. The documents, the confrontation, the systematic betrayal that had stripped away everything I thought I knew about my life. But instead of despair, I felt something new stirring in my chest, a cold, determined anger. Standing slowly, I walked to the window and watched the sunrise paint our neighborhood in soft golden light. Mrs. Henderson was already in her garden, tending to the roses Robert had helped her plant last spring. Beamed. Johnson's dog was barking at the mailman, the same routine that had played out for years. Life was continuing normally for everyone else while my world had been turned upside down. But I was still here, still breathing, still capable of fighting back. I made my way to Robert's workshop, moving with purpose for the first time in days. Sitting at his workbench, surrounded by tools he'd used to build our life together, I felt his presence more strongly than I had since his death. "You didn't raise a quitter," I said aloud to his memory, "and you didn't marry one either." Robert had always admired my strength, the fierce protectiveness I'd shown as a teacher when bullies targeted my students. "Margaret doesn't back down when she knows she's right," he used to tell people with pride. I thought about my 40 years in the classroom, dealing with manipulative parents, dishonest administrators, and systems designed to defeat dedicated teachers. I'd fought budget cuts that threatened art programs, challenged principals who played favorites, and stood up to school board members who cared more about politics than children. I'd never once backed down when something mattered, and my marriage and my home mattered more than anything I'd ever fought for. The woman who had raised David with endless patience and love was also the woman who had faced down angry parents, incompetent supervisors, and bureaucratic nonsense with unwavering determination. I taught hundreds of children to stand up to bullies, to speak truth to power, to never let anyone make them feel small or worthless. Now my own son and daughter-in-law were the bullies, and it was time to practice what I'd preached. I picked up one of Robert's hammers, feeling its familiar weight in my hand. He'd taught me to use his tools over the years, insisting that I should be able to fix things myself if needed. "Independence is the most important thing I can give you," he'd said. "Never let anyone make you helpless." The irony was bitter. David was trying to make me helpless, to paint me as incompetent and confused, when Robert had spent decades ensuring I was exactly the opposite. Walking back through our house, I saw it with new eyes. This wasn't just a building to be sold for profit. It was a testament to everything Robert and I had accomplished together. Every room held memories of love, sacrifice, and hard work. The kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals with joy. The living room where we'd raised our son and welcomed friends. The bedroom where we'd shared our most intimate moments and deepest fears. David and Sarah thought they were dealing with a broken, grieving old woman who would accept their decisions without resistance. They had no idea they'd awakened a fighter who had spent 4 decades protecting what mattered most. They'd underestimated the strength that comes from righteous anger and the power of a mother who finally understood that her greatest act of love would be refusing to let her son destroy everything good about himself. The real Margaret was done hiding. The real Margaret was ready for war. My first call was to Robert's original lawyer, Harold Matthews, who had drawn up our authentic will 15 years ago. Harold had been Robert's friend since high school, and when I explained the situation, his voice turned ice cold. "Margaret, what you're describing is elder abuse and fraud," he said firmly. "That document David showed you isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Robert's real will is in my safe, witnessed properly and filed correctly. You inherit everything, just as he always intended." Harold agreed to meet me privately that afternoon, bringing copies of all our legitimate legal documents. The relief was overwhelming. I wasn't losing my mind and I wasn't losing my home. But more importantly, Harold confirmed that the signatures on the forged will were poorly executed fakes, and the power of attorney was invalid due to Robert's documented medical condition during the alleged signing date. "We have them dead to rights," Harold said, his anger matching mine. "But I recommend we gather more evidence before we confront them. Let them think they're getting away with it a little longer." That evening, I visited my neighbor Tom, who worked in electronic security. I explained that I was concerned about break-ins since Robert's death and needed a discreet security system. Tom, who had always been fond of Robert and me, installed tiny cameras in the living room, kitchen, and David's old bedroom, where he'd hidden the documents. The devices were nearly invisible, tucked behind picture frames and inside decorative objects. I also purchased a small digital recorder, which I began carrying in my pocket during every interaction with David and Sarah. Harold had explained that in our state, I could legally record conversations as long as I was a participant. Every phone call, every visit, every casual comment would now be preserved as evidence. The hardest part of my plan involved my grandchildren. I arranged separate visits with each of them while David and Sarah were at work, carefully documenting the lies they'd been told. 8-year-old Emma innocently repeated that Grandma's brain is getting sick, and that she'd need to live in a special place with doctors. 10-year-old Michael had been told that the house was too dangerous for me, and that selling it was the only way to keep Grandma safe. I recorded these conversations with a broken heart, knowing that my own son had used my beloved grandchildren as weapons in his scheme. But their innocent words would prove that David and Sarah had been preparing the family narrative long before confronting me, showing premeditation rather than genuine concern. My next step was visiting our bank with Harold. We froze the accounts that David had been accessing illegally and filed formal complaints about the fraudulent transactions. The bank's fraud department was horrified to learn that nearly $80,000 had been transferred using forged documents while Robert was hospitalized and heavily medicated. I contacted the nursing homes where Sarah had made deposits, explaining that I was the victim of elder fraud and had never consented to admission. The administrators were shocked to learn they'd been dealing with criminals and immediately refunded the deposits while providing written statements about Sarah's deceptive actions. Harold helped me craft a careful strategy for the confrontation. We would let David and Sarah reveal more of their plan while recording everything, then present them with the choice between criminal prosecution or quietly returning everything they'd stolen. The evidence was already overwhelming, but Harold wanted their full confession on record. "They think you're a helpless old woman," Harold said with grim satisfaction. "They have no idea they're dealing with someone who has 40 years of experience, outsmarting people who underestimate her." The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for them to walk into it, confident in their belief that they'd successfully destroyed the woman who had given them everything. I spent 3 days planning what I told David would be my farewell family gathering before moving to Golden Years Manor. "I want to say goodbye to everyone properly," I explained during our phone call, my voice perfectly calibrated to sound resigned and defeated. It would mean the world to me to have one last dinner in the house where we made so many memories. David's relief was audible. He thought I'd finally accepted their plan without further resistance. The invitation list was carefully curated for maximum impact. I called my sister Janet, who drove up from Florida specifically for what she thought was a genuine farewell dinner. My longtime neighbors, Tom and Linda, who had shared countless holidays with Robert and me, accepted immediately, concerned about my supposed declining health. Robert's brother Frank and his wife came from across town, along with my former teaching colleague Susan and her husband. I even invited Father McKenna from our parish, explaining that I needed spiritual guidance during this difficult transition. Sarah threw herself into helping with preparations, her performance of the caring daughter-in-law reaching Oscar-worthy levels. She brought flowers, helped rearrange furniture to accommodate more guests, and even offered to cook some dishes. "You shouldn't have to work so hard on your last day here," she said, with what appeared to be genuine emotion. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have been moved by her apparent devotion. David arrived early with a bottle of wine and an attitude of barely contained triumph. He surveyed the dining room with the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd successfully manipulated every aspect of the situation. "This is nice, Mom," he said, squeezing my shoulder in a gesture that once would have comforted me, but now felt predatory. "I think you're making the right choice. The nursing home will be so much better for you." Harold Matthews arrived fashionably late, introduced simply as Robert's old friend who wanted to pay his respects. Most of the guests knew Harold from church and community events, but David and Sarah had never met him. Their casual greeting betrayed no awareness that they were shaking hands with the lawyer who held the keys to their destruction. As guests filled our dining room, I moved through the familiar rituals of hosting with a strange sense of peace. This room had witnessed David's childhood birthday parties, Robert's retirement celebration, countless holiday dinners filled with laughter and love. Tonight, it would witness the reckoning that would determine whether those memories retained any meaning or were simply the backdrop for an elaborate con game. The conversation flowed naturally, with guests sharing fond memories of Robert and expressing concern about my upcoming transition. Sarah played her role perfectly, discussing the nursing home's amenities and my supposed excitement about new adventures with people my own age. David nodded along, occasionally adding comments about how difficult this decision had been for the family. I caught Harold's eye during the main course, and he gave me an almost imperceptible nod. The small digital recorder in my pocket was capturing everything, and the hidden cameras were documenting the performance from multiple angles. Every sympathetic comment from our guests, every manipulative response from David and Sarah, every moment of their elaborate deception was being preserved for posterity. As dessert was served, my famous apple pie that had graced this table for decades, I felt the weight of the moment approaching. Soon the masks would come off, the truth would be revealed, and the people I had trusted most would face the consequences of their betrayal. The room buzzed with warm conversation and genuine affection, completely unaware that they were about to witness the exposure of a conspiracy that had been months in the making. The stage was set, the evidence was gathered, and justice was finally within reach. As I stood to serve coffee and cut final pieces of pie, I caught Harold's eye and gave him the signal we'd rehearsed. He cleared his throat and rose from his chair, his authoritative presence immediately commanding attention from the gathered family and friends. "Before we conclude this lovely evening," Harold announced, "I'm afraid there are some legal matters that need to be addressed. Margaret has asked me here tonight not just as Robert's friend, but as her attorney." The color drained from David's face instantly. Sarah's fork clattered against her dessert plate, and I watched confusion ripple through our guests as they sensed the evening's tone shifting dramatically. "I don't understand," David stammered, his voice tight. "Mom, what's going on? You said this was a farewell dinner." I stood beside Harold, feeling stronger than I had in months. "It is a farewell dinner, David, but not the kind you were expecting." I pulled out the folder of forged documents and placed them on the table where everyone could see. "I'm saying farewell to the lies, the manipulation, and the family members who thought they could steal everything your father and I built together." Sarah shot to her feet. "Margaret, you're confused. We're trying to help you." "Help me?" I interrupted, my voice carrying across the stunned room. "Is that what you call forging my husband's signature while he was dying? Is that what you call draining his business accounts without my knowledge? Is that what you call putting deposits down on nursing homes I never agreed to enter?" Harold stepped forward with professional calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing is the exposure of elder fraud. David and Sarah have spent months systematically stealing from Margaret while planning to have her declared incompetent and institutionalized against her will." The room erupted. My sister Janet gasped audibly. Father McKenna leaned forward in shock. The neighbors exchanged horrified glances as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. "That's not true," David shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "She's not thinking clearly since Dad died. The will is legitimate." "The will you're referring to," Harold interrupted, producing Robert's genuine will from his briefcase, "is a forgery. This is Robert's real will, properly witnessed and filed, leaving everything to his beloved wife, Margaret. The document you've been using was supposedly signed when Robert was heavily sedated and barely conscious. But I wasn't finished. I had saved the most devastating revelation for this moment." There's something else you all should know, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. For the past 3 weeks, I've been recording every conversation and documenting every lie. I pulled out my small digital recorder and played back Sarah's voice from just hours earlier. The nursing home will be so much better for you. You're making the right choice. Then David's voice. This decision has been so difficult for the family. Even tonight, I continued, while sitting at my dinner table and accepting my hospitality, you've been lying to every person in this room about your motives. You told my grandchildren that Grandma's brain was getting sick. You told our neighbors I was becoming dangerous to myself. You convinced professionals that I was incompetent while I was perfectly capable of running circles around both of you. Sarah began crying, but they were tears of rage, not remorse. You recorded us. You manipulative. I learned from the best, I replied calmly. The difference is I was protecting myself from criminals. You were destroying a woman who loved you unconditionally. Harold placed his hand on my shoulder. Margaret, these recordings, combined with the forged documents and fraudulent financial transactions, constitute multiple felonies. David and Sarah are facing serious prison time. The silence in the room was deafening as the full magnitude of their betrayal sank in among our guests, and David and Sarah realized their carefully constructed lies had crumbled completely. The aftermath moved swiftly and decisively. Harold had prepared all the necessary paperwork in advance, and within 48 hours of that devastating dinner party, David and Sarah faced a choice: criminal prosecution with potential prison sentences of 5 to 10 years, or immediate restitution of all stolen funds plus punitive damages in exchange for plea agreements that would still result in criminal records and supervised probation. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, the recordings, forged documents, fraudulent bank transfers, and witness testimony from the nursing home administrators they'd deceived, David and Sarah chose restitution. The $80,000 they'd stolen from Robert's business account was returned with interest. They were required to pay an additional $50,000 in damages for emotional distress and legal fees. Most satisfying of all, they were both sentenced to 200 hours of community service at elder care facilities, where they would spend the next 2 years learning what genuine care for the elderly actually looked like. The house remained mine, of course, along with all of Robert's assets exactly as he had intended. But more than the financial victory, I had reclaimed my identity, my dignity, and my right to make my own decisions about my future. The narrative of the confused, declining old woman who needed to be managed and controlled had been thoroughly destroyed, replaced by the truth. I was a sharp, capable woman who had outmaneuvered 2 people who had seriously underestimated her. My grandchildren were the innocent victims in this entire ordeal, and rebuilding their trust became my most important mission. Through family counseling sessions, they slowly learned that the lies about Grandma's sick brain and need for special doctors had been part of their parents' scheme. 8-year-old Emma asked me directly, "Grandma, are you really sick?" When I assured her that I was perfectly healthy and sharp, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I knew you were still my real grandma." The children moved in temporarily with Robert's brother Frank and his wife, who provided stability while David and Sarah dealt with the legal consequences of their actions. I had unlimited visitation rights and used them generously, rebuilding the loving relationship that had been poisoned by their parents' manipulation. We planted a memorial garden for Grandpa Robert, read stories on the same couch where I'd once read to their father, and slowly healed the damage that greed had inflicted on our family bonds. My relationship with David and Sarah was permanently severed. Trust, once broken so completely, couldn't be repaired with apologies or excuses. They had looked me in the eye while planning my destruction, had used my grief as a weapon against me, and had involved innocent children in their scheme. Some betrayals are simply unforgivable, and this was one of them. But my life flourished in ways I hadn't expected. The story of my fight back spread through our community, and I found myself becoming an inadvertent advocate for elder rights. I began speaking at community centers and senior groups about recognizing the warning signs of family financial abuse. Other elderly people shared their stories with me. Children who had manipulated parents into signing over property, relatives who had used power of attorney as licenses to steal, family members who had used love as a mask for greed. The house on Maple Street remained my sanctuary, but it was no longer a monument to the past. It became a gathering place for genuine family. My sister, Robert's brother, my grandchildren, and the neighbors who had supported me throughout this ordeal. I renovated Robert's workshop into a bright reading room where my grandchildren did homework, and I pursued the hobbies I'd never had time for during my teaching years. Most importantly, I learned that surviving betrayal doesn't make you bitter. It makes you wiser, stronger, and more protective of the love that remains worth protecting. 6 months later, I stood in my garden on a warm spring morning, watching the roses Robert and I had planted bloom more beautifully than they ever had before. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sometimes the deepest pruning produces the most magnificent growth. My life had been cut back to its roots by betrayal, but what had grown from that painful experience was stronger and more authentic than anything I'd known before. The memorial garden I'd created with my grandchildren had become the heart of our healing. Emma and Michael visited every weekend, helping me tend the vegetables that Grandpa Robert had loved, and learning the same lessons about nurturing and patience that I'd once tried to teach their father. We talked openly about what their parents had done, age-appropriately but honestly, because I refused to build our new relationship on lies or secrets. Sometimes people make very bad choices, I explained to them, but that doesn't mean love isn't real or that family can't be trusted. It just means we have to choose our family more carefully. I kept Robert's wedding ring in a small frame on my mantel, not hidden away in shame or displayed in anger, but present as a reminder of what real love looks like. Real love protects rather than exploits, builds up rather than tears down, and honors the vulnerable rather than preying upon them. David and Sarah had forgotten those lessons, but they remained the foundation of everything meaningful in my life. My speaking engagements at senior centers had evolved into something I'd never expected, a second career as an advocate for elder rights. I'd helped 12 other families recognize and fight financial abuse, working with Harold to expose relatives who thought aging parents were easy targets. Each victory felt like honoring Robert's memory and proving that the strength he'd always seen in me was real and enduring. The house had become livelier than it had been in years. My sister Janet visited monthly, staying in David's renovated bedroom and helping me host dinner parties for our real friends and genuine family. Neighbors stopped by regularly, not out of pity for the poor widow, but out of respect for the woman who had fought back and won. The dining room table where David and Sarah had been exposed now hosted book club meetings, community planning sessions, and celebrations of life's authentic joys. I'd learned that betrayal teaches you things that ordinary life never could. It shows you the difference between people who love you and people who love what you can provide. It reveals the strength you never knew you possessed and the courage that emerges when everything you value is threatened. Most importantly, it teaches you that surviving doesn't require forgiveness. Sometimes it requires boundaries, justice, and the wisdom to know that some people aren't worthy of your trust, even when they share your DNA. My story isn't unique. Across America, elderly parents are being manipulated by adult children who see inheritance as something to be claimed rather than earned. Family members are using love as leverage and trust as a weapon. But my story proves that age doesn't equal helplessness, grief doesn't equal incompetence, and being kind doesn't mean being naive. Every person has the right to make their own decisions about their life, their home, and their legacy. When someone tries to take those rights away, even someone you love, fighting back isn't just appropriate, it's necessary. If you were in my situation, facing the people you loved most trying to steal everything you'd worked for, what would you do? Would you fight back? Or would you accept their version of what was best for you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe for more stories of courage, justice, and the strength we discover when we refuse to be victims. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your family is teaching them that love has boundaries, and crossing those boundaries has consequences.